for that, Hannah. That's CBC's Hannah Thibodeau. John Baird has just announced that Canada is dispatching members of the disaster response team, the DART team, to the typhoon-ravaged Philippine Islands. That's in addition to the up to $5 million in aid the federal government promised yesterday. Also a promise today to match dollar for dollar every contribution Canadians make. The assistance comes at a time when a former Conservative Prime Minister and a former Foreign Minister is making headlines with harsh words around Canada's standing in the world. Joe Clark has a new book out, and it's got a stinging rebuke of the federal government's foreign policy. He's very critical of the shift away from Canada's traditional role as a leader of so-called soft power, areas like development aid, and we heard a lot about that today, or peacekeeping, to focus on trade. So has the Harper government's approach damaged Canada's reputation on the world stage? A couple days ago, I spoke with Joe Clark about it, and I asked him what action needs to be taken to restore, in his view, Canada's reputation. Joining me now, the former Prime Minister of Canada, Joe Clark. Good to see you.
Thank you.
You are the author of a new book, How We Lead, Canada in the Century of Change. Lest anyone think that you have decided to go soft on your views. You haven't. It's as if you wrote this book, Mr. Clark, because you think Canada's reputation on the world stage is in peril. What's your view of how Canada acts on the global stage now?
I wrote it because I think there's a great potential to do much more than we're doing. It does have to do with a marrying of so-called soft power with hard power. I think some things well internationally. Congratulate the Harper government on having pursued trade as much as they are and other things. But I think that they are focusing almost exclusively on one half of our capacity, which is the economic, the military, the trade half. And the world is going in another direction.
You don't mince words, though. You use the words obstreperous and adolescent to describe certain fundamental foreign policies. What do you find adolescent and obstreperous about?
I think it has to do with your view of principle. I think that the Harper government clearly has some principles that it articulates. But principles in life and in international affairs are useful only if you try to apply them. And you can't declare a principle and then not engage. Declare a principle and pull out of Iran. Declare a principle and not go to the Commonwealth Conference in Sri Lanka. Declare a principle and, to all intents and purposes, show disdain for the United Nations, where these things have to be worked out. That's my principal concern.
All right,
about this government.
Let's take this one.
Sure.
You mentioned Iran. Let's talk about Iran. What was your view on the Canada, under the Harper government, their decision to close the embassy in Tehran?
I think it was a mistake. I still have not received a satisfactory explanation for it. I don't know why that happened. But whatever the reason.
Well, they said, I asked, they said they didn't want to deal with that government as a legitimate government.
You have to deal with governments. Whether you think they're legitimate or not, they're there. I had to face that at least twice, two major times in my career. One was in China after the tanks mowed down kids in Tiananmen Square. We could have cut off all relations with China. We didn't. We cut off relations with the government. We followed a very selective, effective group of actions, but we kept lines open so that we could deal with people of whom we disapproved, and that was very successful. The other, of course, was in South Africa. There was a lot of pressure on Canada to pull out of South Africa very early on. Influential people, very considered people, thought that the principle was so important that we should state it and in effect leave. But leaving would have meant that we would have had no impact. Leaving would have had us leave before Nelson Mandela left prison. And I just think that the lessons of our own history indicate the importance of engaging.
Well, you know, I mean, speaking of Iran, the hostage crisis and the engagement and the role Canada played with Ken Taylor, who, you know, the diplomat there, was so essential. Now we're not there in Iran, and the fear has been that in some sense, by being there, you legitimize and or you appease a regime. What's your view?
I don't think you legitimize a regime. What you do is learn about it. And people, I think, widely underestimate the work that diplomats do. It is very often developing friendships where they learn things that would not otherwise be learned, establishing some kind of relation so that someone in Iranian authority who might be looking to change their policy has someone from the West they can talk to. I've used this before in the last couple of days in conversations, but I was in Tehran late in my period as foreign minister. I spoke with senior leaders. It was a kind of confusing, unproductive conversation, and at the end the foreign minister said, "Let's go for a walk." So out we went into this great open field with trees above us, nowhere you could hang a microphone. He said, "We can speak privately now. Here is what we were trying to say to you." That was foreign minister to foreign minister, but that's the kind of conversation that happens with good diplomats all the time, and you learn things from it.
You're critical of the Harper government stance on Israel, on, as you talk about, Iran, and you say that over the past 60 years, the Canadian foreign policy has essentially remained unchanged, from liberal to progressive conservative, but now you say there's a fundamental foreign policy shift, and you call it partisan. My question is, what's wrong with a fundamental policy shift? If the world changed, shouldn't the policy change?
Two things about this shift. One, there's not been much public discussion about it. It's been taken by the government. They have no particular mandate for it. They're not discussing it very much. I think that's a mistake. But secondly,
well, isn't there a mandate getting elected?
They would argue their mandate is getting elected, but I would argue that if you're going to claim you have a mandate, you should have talked about what you're going to do in some of these critical fields before you get there. The more important thing is, of course, the world has changed. And the hard line that Canada is taking now is against that change. It's out of sync with the change. What's happening now is that the capacity to listen to others and to negotiate is more important than ever was, not least because there are so many actors, so many more actors in the field. And
like you talk about NGOs and those kind of, and
NGOs,
also and other countries.
And other countries and citizens. I mean, this is a world in which you can't keep citizens down anymore. The internet has fundamentally transformed international affairs, and that means there are going to be people, ideas, tendencies that are going to be strange to us, startling to us, but we have to try to work with those people. I talk in my book about the greater capacity that many non-state actors have than states have, because states are constrained by laws, by tradition, by accountability. In very many cases, an NGO can do things on the ground in a crisis center, crisis area that governments can't. I talk about marrying the imagination of the NGOs with the mandate of governments. And frankly, to do that in a way that Canada's done before, we did it with the Landmines Treaty, we did it with the International Criminal Court, we should be taking a look at the range of other issues where an initiative such as Mr. Axworthy took on those two questions could be replicated now.
You talk about China. You say that Canada has a pre-Nixonian view of China. But look, Prime Minister Harper started his mandate turning away from China for human rights reasons, and now he's pivoted, to use the kind of in vogue foreign affairs term, back to China for trade reasons.
And as you know, I give him credit for the pivot.
Right.
And I think he was wrong, and I think pre-Nixonian in the way he went at that. But to his great credit, and it was a show of leadership, he realized that the course on which he had embarked was wrong. I don't think he ever apologized for it, but he changed it. And I think that was a very smart thing to do. And now we're going to bear some cost for the original position, but I think that that's a sign of maturity on
how would you describe Stephen Harper's view of foreign affairs?
I think it's a quite narrow and limited view. I think that it's a view sort of rooted and most familiar in the West. I don't think there's a lot of sympathy or understanding for not only the poverty of really poor countries, but the mentality of the developing world. I quote in the book something he said at La Francophone Summit when he suggested that in the future, meetings of that international body should be held only in democracies. Well, that's not the way to move other countries towards democracy. You have to do that on the ground. You have to demonstrate the values of democracy to people who have no trace of it at home.
What do you think of his view of the United Nations, and if he has helped to strengthen it or weaken it?
I think he has not helped strengthen the United Nations, and I think that, again, I'm not entirely sure why that is the case, except I don't think he is instinctively a multilateralist. In his own negotiations at home as well as elsewhere, he tends to prefer dealing with one partner in one place. That's not the way the international world works, and you know, the fundamental question about the United Nations is not whether it is perfect or imperfect. It's clearly, seriously imperfect. The question is, what would we do without it? Where else would there be an opportunity for different countries, different perspectives to come together to have the kind of conversations that on occasion can find important common ground?
Mr. Clark, I would be remiss if I didn't also just ask you quickly about this Senate mess that is engulfing Parliament Hill. And there's a lot of questions, frankly, around the Prime Minister's office, the former Chief of Staff. What's your take on how this is being handled and the questions that are going on, the RCMP investigations? What's your view?
Well, I think the major remaining outstanding question is what was known by whom and when in the Prime Minister's office. And I think the Prime Minister has a very clear duty to make those facts known. I'm quite concerned about what happened in the Senate for two reasons. One, I think it has set a precedent that could be dangerous for acting against individuals before all the evidence is in, and I'm afraid that could be used, I emphasize could, by subsequent governments to reduce even further the independence of the Senate, and the Senate exists to have an independent point of view. And I think it's also tarnishing the institution. And I think too many of our institutions have been damaged by various events. The Senate is the most recent by these events.
But, you know, when you ask about this, conservatives, ministers will say this is a distraction, we should be focusing on other things. I mean, in your view, in a crisis like this, is this the opposition making hay, or is this a fundamental issue now facing the Prime Minister in his office that has to be dealt with in order to keep the legitimacy of the government?
This is becoming a fundamental issue. It wasn't when it began, although I think there were concerns about the degree of control exerted by the political party in office over the members of a body that was supposed to be more independent. But these actions, I think, have exacerbated and strengthened that concern. So I think it now is a fundamental issue that deals with the respect for institutions which have functioned reasonably well in Canada. I say reasonably well. There's no doubt the Senate's popularity has suffered profoundly in the country, and there may be some decisions to be taken about that. They should be taken coolly in terms of what value do our institutions have, what kind of institutions do we need, not in reaction to this kind of hyper crisis.
You want answers.
I want answers from him. I think the public want answers from him. I think he should want answers, unless there's something really devastating that he's not letting be known, but it builds suspicion about him. You can't operate with the legitimacy a head of government needs, or a government as a whole, if people have these lingering large questions about what happened.
Joe Clark, author of a new book, How We Lead Canada in the Century of Change. Great pleasure to have you back on the program, and an absolutely fascinating book. Thanks.
Thank you very much.